woodworking, craftsmanship, innovation. This isn't your average hand tool. This is a Fales plane, a testament to ingenuity and a window into an earlier era of American manufacturing. This remarkable plane was manufactured for decades, yet was lost to the progress of mass production and an enormous marketing machine. But who was the man, or men, behind this unique design? And why was his vision ultimately abandoned? This is the Fales Patent Plane and a dive into its history and functionality. Hey, it's Mosquito, also known as Chris. Welcome to the shop. If you're new here, hi, I've got a plane problem. But probably not what you think. I've been chasing parts for the Fales Patent Plane for a few years now, probably 5 or 6, and I'm still missing a few parts. So if you've got any that you're looking to sell or trade, hit me up. I've got most, but I always keep an eye out. American industrial innovation and craftsmanship. This is about the partnership of the manufacturer Otis A Smith and the inventor Amos Fales. Their collaboration produced one of the more interesting, in my opinion, woodworking tools of the era, the Fales Patent Combination Plane. Let's examine some of the history of the Otis A Smith Manufacturing Company, the details about this plane, how it could be used, and some of the insights behind the men that brought this thing to life. All right, but what the heck is a Fales Patent Plane? A few examples. This is one. This is another. So this has a side bead profile on it, so it sort of has a little bit of a built-in fence here, and that just rides along the edge of the workpiece and then allows you to cut a bead right on the edge of a board. That guy right there. And that can be done, again, with just this one plane and then these bottom bases for both the front and the back. So this one is set up for a standard bead, I guess, so just like a center bead. And I was doing some messing around with it, and I kind of made this reeded, or shows you that you can just kind of keep walking it across the board and you can get a bunch of beads just like you would if you were reading something. You just kind of move it over as you keep working. But again, it's just a front and a back base, and there's just a little bead right in the middle, and that is what does all of the work there. Getting into some other more interesting ones, this one has kind of a, I think this was the Ovalo or the OG, I don't remember which, profile. I'm not very good with my moldings, but basically same concept. You've got the two bases, front, back. This one's curved and a little bit different. So that'll actually create a profile like this as you're cutting. Again, just another form that you could have gotten with this plane. Those are two things that are using the two fences. This one has its own built-in fence, but they also supplied this grooving attachment, which they say is best used with a secondary main stock. Go figure, because they would always prefer to sell more. But the idea would be you can set up, sort of like how I've got one of them set up for sash cutting, which I'll show you in a second. You can set up for tongue and groove, where one iron actually gets held in the fence. So kind of like right here, one of them would get held in the fence, and then the other one gets held in the main body itself. And you can use that to cut the tongue side of the board. And then the idea would be you would take a plane with that grooving attachment on it, and then you could just set that groove to be whatever you need, and then you can cut the tongue with one plane and then switch over to your other plane to cut the actual groove. And so you can just kind of go back and forth and do things pretty quickly that way. You can also flip this fence around, so you kind of take it and flip it end for end that way, as you can unscrew it from here and just flip these two brackets around. And then they say that you can use it for a front filister. That kind of covers the main pieces of it. The last thing that I wanted to show was this one is actually set up for sash, and there's a couple of different ways that you can do the sash moldings with this plane. They have a couple of different profiles. These are the three different profiles here. There's kind of the, what I would consider standard sash profile here, and then there's this reverse, and then there is the chamfer. And when you're doing the chamfer, we've got a depth stop right here, and there's this little groove in the depth stop right in that middle here. So this big one goes around the screw that holds the bases on, but there's this little one right there in the middle, and that can hold this. So you would put this on your depth stop, and that gives you a depth stop with that angle on it, and that matches the angle if you're cutting your sash with the bevel. But let's actually see this thing do some work. I've already cut one side of the sash. I'm going to try and cut the other. I will say it's a little bit finicky to get set up sometimes, and I don't think I have it 100% dialed in. They actually say you're supposed to use this 7/8 inch rabbet. I'm using a 3/8 inch just because that's what I happened to have on hand sharp. As with a lot of these molding planes, I'm going to start at the end, and the important thing is to keep this vertical. That's pretty much the same with all your planes. So here we go. One thing that I will say, I don't know if this is better on the 7/8 inch, but it does have a tendency to jam up a bit. And I think that pretty much gets us all the way down. Grab some of our debris. Not a perfect profile, but you get the idea. Last thing before we get into some of the rest of it, but this is the setup for tongue and groove. So you can see that there's an iron over here in the fence and an iron in the plane body, and that will take care of our tongue. I do have the depth stop set for the groove over here on the outside, and that's not entirely necessary because the actual brackets for the fence itself kind of act as the depth stop, and those are about a 32nd of an inch over 1/4 of an inch. So your groove is going to be slightly deeper than your tongue, which is pretty much what you want. And one thing that I forgot to do is pick out a piece that has exceptionally cooperative grain. So that is our tongue, and I'm just going to make sure that I am actually lined up here. And it looks like I am pretty close, although I'm also realizing that I have the 5/16 inch iron in here, and that is not what I want. Ah, right. This was the one that I wanted. Helps to get the right plane, huh? All right, correct plane, and we will use that to cut our groove. And there we are down. I'd call that pretty good. If your joints don't fit, find a big enough hammer to see that they will. And then just to sort of hide any ugliness, I've got a bead here. Hide any little gaps that we may have had with that bead, and then give us some room for expansion. You can see it from the end. Smith was born in Ludlow, Massachusetts on September 19th of 1836, and initially gained manufacturing experience through working as both an apprentice and a journeyman, largely in manufacturing firearms and parts, though he did have a brief hiatus in some of the, I guess, like sewing machine trade at the time. These experiences would prove invaluable for his future, as Smith would later go on to build upon that knowledge to establish his own manufacturing company. It got its start in 1862 by Otis A. Smith and Charles A. King in Middlefield, which is just a little bit southwest of Rockfall. In 1864, King and Smith started manufacturing different parts for Smith & Wesson, the other Smith, under contract for some of their pistols at the time. I think it was the Model 1.5 or something like that. And that arrangement must have been working out fairly well, because it continued up until 1869, when the last known contract for 5,000 parts were executed. The company's physical location carried some historical importance. The site had been used for manufacturing since at least 1740. The original dam at that location was constructed at that point, with the first recorded use for that space dating back to 1798. Jehoshaphat Stowe, I think it was, built a mill for apparently cutting nails by machine, which supposedly was the first of its kind in America, but that wasn't really the focus of any of this research, so I haven't really dug deep enough into that to confirm it. The property had several transformations over the coming decades. Some of it was used for wire manufacturing around 1812, and wool carding a few years after that, which, in case you don't know what wool carding is, neither did I. I had to look it up. But it's the like spiky paddle things that you can use to pull the wool fibers apart to make it, I guess, cleaner, straighter, and be able to start using it for wool. Pivotal moment in the plant's history occurred in 1845. Henry and Nelson Aston, John North, I gotta look at some notes here, Peter Ashton and Sylvester Bailey demolished and replaced that existing mill with a new building and a new dam, and then they were mass producing firearms with interchangeable parts. From 1852 to 1879, Ira Johnson, whom was one of Smith's former employers, manufactured pistols at that same location up until around 1879, I think it was September, when the factory unfortunately burned to the ground. And that destruction ultimately created an opportunity for Smith, as in December of 1881, he bought the site, the building remains, any of the machinery that was there still, the dam, and the water rights for $2,000. He later put up a 3-story building that was built out of brick. It was 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. Smith's company operated under a couple of different names throughout its history, including there was King and Smith, there was Savage and Smith, and then obviously eventually it was just Otis A. Smith Manufacturing Company. And while firearms were definitely still a significant part of the business, by the early 1900s, late 1800s, Smith had redirected the company's focus to not just be on firearms, but also include some hardware products. And that pivot included the manufacturing of the Fales Patent Plane. That would become one of the company's more technically complex things and maybe historically significant non-firearm products. This is the Fales Patent Plane, not the Smith Patent Plane. And Amos Fales, unlike Smith, was not a Connecticut resident, but rather he was from Denver, Colorado. Personal details about Fales are a lot harder to come by, as his technical ingenuity is pretty well documented through the patents that he received. Correspondence with an agreement being signed between Fales and Smith on September 21st of 1883, which allowed Smith to be the sole manufacturer of the Fales Patent Plane for the duration of the patents. And the royalty is how Fales was actually going to be making his money out of that deal, and that was 2.5% of the sales. I don't know if that was a lot or not a lot. Doesn't sound like a lot now. Maybe it was back then, but based on his patents, it seems as though he had moved from Denver to Rockfall, Connecticut at some point between 1884 and 1886, probably to help out with the manufacture and distribution of his planes, though he was also noted in some of the Smith ledgers to have been paid for basically working in the shop. But His 1884 patent listed him as being of Denver, Colorado, and his next 1886 patent lists him of Rockfall, Connecticut. So between 1882 and 1888, Fales secured several patents for his revolutionary combination plane design, with his first patent being applied for in December of 1881 and finally being granted in March of 1882. And this patent was for a combination plane that would have a changeable cutter and separate forms for front and back, being independently attached to the main stock. That ultimately isn't the plane that actually ended up getting manufactured, because the following patent was granted in April of 1884, and that included improvements such as the inclined handle. So rather than a handle more like a traditional combination plane that we would see now, it kind of went to this more broomstick looking thing. And then also kind of a little bit more of a traditional fence that it has for the ability to clamp something in for an additional iron. In total, Fales received 4 different patents related to his combination plane design, including another one that was dated in 1886 for adding a grooving attachment, which is this, as well as spurs, which can go in here, and a final patent in 1888, which added a specialized V-profile cutter and base to the plane, at least as far as the plane was concerned. There was a couple other patents that he in there for like a vise and for a panel cutting scribing gauge. The Fales patent plane stands as probably one of the more complex combination planes produced during the late 19th century, and it was officially designated the variable bench plane. This thing was marketed as 80 different planes in one, at least at part of its life. A claim that, while technically true, probably proved otherwise. What made the Fales plane revolutionary was its system of interchangeable bases. It would have one portion behind and one portion in front of the actual main casting. This design effectively mimicked the principles of the wooden planes of the era, so hollows and rounds would be very similar looking to this. Now, I don't have any actual evidence, but it wasn't too long after the Fales combination plane was patented in 1882, and by 1886, Stanley had patented their auxiliary hollow and round and nosing bases. I don't know if it was cause and effect, but at least it shows that this was the trend of its time, at the very least. Unlike Stanley, however, the Fales plane didn't stop at just the hollows and rounds. It featured an extensive array of components. Craftsmen were to order all possible bottoms and irons and accessories for this thing. Back in the day, it would have been around 240 pieces and about $35. I will pay you $35 for that many pieces, but that's roughly equivalent to around $1,300 if you were buying it all. Not an insignificant investment. Disregarding the substantial cost, however, this level of customization kind of allowed woodworkers to achieve virtually any molding profile required for whatever work they were doing, just like a set of hollows and rounds. One downside, however, is that trying to keep track of 150 bottoms and pieces and irons and keep them all organized, readily available, yeah. The Fales patent plane's comprehensive nature made it particularly valuable to craftsmen who needed to perform a bunch of different woodworking tasks but had limited space for numerous specialized tools, though one could argue that each set of bases and iron were in and of themselves their own specialized set of tools. But regardless, it did cut down on the physical space requirement. It was advertised as being able to be stored in just 1 cubic foot, but I can't imagine how organized that would be with all these parts, because that's a little bit larger than this box, and I don't know how that'll work out. But despite its complexity, the plane was manufactured with an almost simplistic quality to it. The fact that examples have survived to the present day in remarkably good condition, some of them still being in their original boxes, is pretty cool. Today, these things are pretty sought after by collectors that want to try and seek out the full set. Just a reminder on that note, if you have any parts and you want to trade or sell, do let me know. Comments or shoot me a message, hit me up, something. The Fales patent plane was offered for sale from early 1883 until around 1917 from the records that I could find, when the manufacturing ceased. And despite its complexity, or maybe because of it, the plane sold well enough to remain on the market for a better part of 3 decades. I am aware of 2 letters in 1885, and one was in July and one was in October, that have a pretty stark contrast and a pretty big shift in what Otis A. Smith's opinion of the plane was. July letter, he wrote, "Our Fales plane is having a big run in the US, and we think with a little effort you might sell lots of them in foreign places." This indicated that maybe they were trying to sell some in maybe Europe. I believe there were some indications that maybe Italy was one of those places. I'm not really sure of that, so if anybody's found any of the examples of these being sold in the European region, that'd be pretty cool to find out. But by October, his tune had changed a bit, saying, "We are sorry business is so dull it would not pay you to travel for the sale of planes. This is the slowest sale article I have ever had anything to do with. There may be better times, but I see no indication of it. Mr. Fales thinks the only way to sell it is to get agents that are located to canvas. I am sick of the whole thing, but have put out so much money in it that I must stick a while longer." Now, this was presumably to somebody that was inquiring about being a traveling salesperson or interested in selling the planes, but I don't know how many of these things were ever manufactured or even a rough estimate. Things must have improved eventually, since the plane did remain in manufacture until 1917. Who knows how long things took to take off long enough to make them viable, but despite its technical merits, the Fales plane ultimately faced some pretty stiff competition from the Stanley Rule and Level Company with these Stanley 45s that they were starting to introduce, as well as the number 50s and things like the 55 for more complicated moldings and stuff like that. But their giant marketing machine and their expansive distribution network rapidly rose to become kind of the dominant tool manufacturer, at least especially of the Connecticut area. Their combination planes, well, maybe a little bit less comprehensive, would have offered a lot better simplicity. I mean, this thing is a lot easier to set up, and affordability too. So maybe that appealed to the evolving market, or maybe it was just too complex to try to keep track of all these pieces and for the Fales plane to be generally viable. But either way, seems as though it's pretty obvious that Stanley kind of won out on that one, and the Fales plane got sort of shoved aside, made way for the Stanleys. A little bit more about the legacy that was left behind, both the kind of the personal and the business. Otis Smith, I mean, he kind of embodied the spirit of the American industrial entrepreneur during the height of it. I mean, not only through his manufacturing, but also in his approach to community building. In my research, unlike many of the manufacturers of his era who built their homes a long way away from the factory, Smith actually constructed his home in his mill village, right kind of in the middle of it. The workers' houses were situated around it, and he was just right in the thick of things. And that demonstrated a different approach to management during that era, where he was more of a community foster and less of just a baron. And one could argue that perhaps the manufacturing wasn't quite as significant as some of those other tool barons or manufacturing titans of the day, but either way, believe what you want, I guess. By 1920, Smith was reported to be retired and was living in his home with his daughter, grandchildren, and a nurse, as his health was beginning to fail at that point, and Smith ultimately passed away on June 23rd of 1923 at the age of 88, leaving behind his manufacturing legacy. After Otis Smith Manufacturing ceased operations, the factory building itself again went through several transitions. Around the 1970s, the factory housed a small antique store, and in 1974 it was used as a machine shop, various other things that kind of came and went. And by 1994, the building was pretty much falling into disrepair until a man by the name of Dick Boynton, don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but anyway, he purchased it in 1994, and it took 4 years, but he worked through restoring it and converting it into a residence. And through some of my research, I found out that not only did he turn it into his residence, but he's got a shop. I guess I'm making some assumptions. The last I've seen of Dick Boynton around online reference is in like 2013, 2014. So I'm not sure if he's actually still around anymore or not. Once he had converted it to his residence, he also had some space in it that was used as community meeting space or event spaces, and just generally used for things like that. The history of the Otis A Smith Manufacturing Company and the Fales Patent Plane offers insight into American industrial innovation during the late 19th century. Its transformation from a firearms apprentice, firearms manufacturer, and then to a diversified hardware producer shows the adaptability needed for businesses to thrive during that period. Meanwhile, Fales' complex plane design represents a fascinating effort to consolidate multiple woodworking functions into a single adaptable tool, a concept that continues to influence tools today. I mean, look at routers, for example. You can make all kinds of different profiles with a router. One router, a bunch of different bits. We still have new combination planes coming out from the likes of Veritas. The partnership between Smith and Fales, a manufacturer from Connecticut and an inventor from Colorado, also shows the nature of American business relationships changing during that period of industrialization. I don't know if it was improvements in communication, transportation, but it allowed for a collaboration across a pretty big distance, but I don't actually know how that came about. If you have any additional information about the Fales Patent Plane or the Otis A Smith Manufacturing Company, I would certainly be interested to find out. If you could just, leave me some info in the comments down below, I will see what I can dig up. While both the Fales Plane and the Smith Company were eventually overshadowed by larger competitors, their contributions to manufacturing history and tool development remain pretty sought after by collectors, and today those surviving Fales Patent Planes stand as a treasured tool to those of us that are daring to go down that road of trying to find all the pieces. But it offers a tangible connection to the ingenuity and craftsmanship of Americans past, and I just find that pretty interesting. All right, that was a dive into the Otis A Smith Company and the Fales Patent Plane, and I hope you liked that journey. It was a lot of fun going down that rabbit hole, and boy, was it a rabbit hole. I've got a whole bunch of information on the actual factory and a lot of different information about the evolution and some of the companies that were there and a lot of the things that it kind of went through in its transformation, but that wasn't really the focus of this video, but I still found it interesting nonetheless. Maybe I'll put together a blog, and if I do, I'll link it down in the description and just provide some of that detail, because it was pretty interesting to me, and if you're interested in these Fales Patent Planes, maybe it'll be interesting to you. Anyway, I appreciate those of you that stuck around this far, and I will catch you in the next one.